Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm Liz Kay. If you missed this year's Anna E. Lavoie Memorial Lecture, you're in luck. Listen now as alums Brianna Abbott and Mallary Tenore discuss science and health communication in the era of COVID-19. Abbott, who majored in chemistry and creative writing, is a health reporter for the Wall Street Journal. After graduating in 2017, she earned a master's degree in journalism with a concentration in science, health, and environmental reporting at New York University. Mallary Tenore majored in English and Spanish at PC and graduated in 2007. She teaches journalism at the University of Texas at Austin's Moody College of Communication. She has a master's degree in nonfiction writing from Goucher College in Maryland and is the author of the soon-to-be-released book titled Slit: Recovery, Sickness, and the Space in Between, which explores the complexities of eating disorders and recovery.
Great. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here and very happy to have this opportunity to come back to campus. It's been over 10 years since I've been back, so much has changed, and just really delighted to be here and so happy that there is this new communication with Meyer. So I think my slides should be coming up momentarily. Oh, yes. Okay. Perfect. All right. So as was mentioned, I'm a proud PC graduated in 2007, and I currently work at the University of Texas at Austin, where I work in the Moody College of Communications primarily, and also in the McCombs Business School. So I teach mostly writing in a journalistic sense, and also teach writing to accountants for learning how to write well and clearly and concisely. I'm also Associate Director of the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas at UT Austin, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So during today's talk, I'm going to explain how I moved from PC to UT, from Go Friars to FOCUM. And so I'll talk a little bit about that transition, and in the second part, I'll talk more specifically about my work during COVID-19. So I just want to take you back in time a little bit. I started off in journalism when I was a junior in high school, when I had an internship in a very small weekly newspaper called the Holliston Tab, which is my hometown newspaper. And while I was there was a reporter who really took me under her wing. Her name was Teresa Ito, and she was a PC graduate. And so she had told me about PC, really encouraged me to apply, and I decided to take her word for it. I applied and fell in love with the campus. And while I was at PC, I think it was my second day on campus, I very promptly went to the Cowell office and showed them my binder full of newspaper articles from the Holliston Tab and said, "Can I join the Cowell?" And fortunately, they brought me on board, and I was a reporter, and then by senior year, I was editor-in-chief of the newspaper. So it was a really great experience to be able to get practical hands-on experience of writing stories and editing stories, and I really loved my time at the Cowell. So it's a great place to continue to sort of hone your skills and develop new ones. And there were lots of influential alums who I met along the way. One was John C. Quinn, who graduated from PC in 1945. He's the co-founder of USA Today, and I had a scholarship in his name at UT, or at PC rather. I'm going to confuse my acronyms there, at PC, and he was really someone who helped me to figure out sort of what I wanted to do with my career. He was really instrumental in helping sort of minority students to get into the field of journalism. And so I really admired his efforts and considered him a great mentor. He passed away a few years ago. But then my other great mentors were Peter Clark. He's often referred to as the godfather of good writing. And he just so happens to be the godfather of my daughter, Madeline, who's pictured there. He's working on his 20th book now on writing, which comes out next month. So he's just a great resource and mentor. And I remember sitting in my dorm in St. Thomas Aquinas sophomore year, and I was just starting to Google journalism and PC grads. I was trying to find some graduates who had gone off to do journalism, and his name popped up. And I saw he was going to be at a writers' conference in Connecticut that I was also planning to go to. And so I just emailed him on a whim, told him I would be at the conference to see if he would be willing to meet with me. He said yes, and encouraged me to apply for this 6-week fellowship at the Poynter Institute because I was getting ready to graduate. So I applied for the internship and ended up getting it. And a 6-week fellowship turned into a 6-year-long job at the Poynter Institute. If you're not following Poynter, it's a great resource for people in communications. It's basically a journalism think tank where professional communicators go to the Poynter Institute in Florida to learn all about journalism ethics and reporting and storytelling and leadership and management in newsrooms. And so I learned so much while I was there. I taught journalists how to use social media as a reporting and editing tool while I was there, because it was very much sort of nascent at the time. Twitter had just come out. All these different social media sites were beginning to pop up, and journalists were trying to figure out how do we use these for our storytelling. So I did that, and then was also managing editor of Poynter.org, which is a site that publishes news and information about the media industry as well as best practices for journalists. So I was there for a little while and continued to do some teaching for the Institute. And I don't know if it's locked or what, but I'll just keep talking in the interest of time. So, oh, there we go. It's working. Okay. There we go. Okay. So at Poynter, I ended up working for this very small nonprofit. It was called Images and Voices of Hope, or IVO for short. And while I was there, it really helped to develop this storytelling genre that we called restorative narrative, which is looking at stories that tell stories about communities that are rebuilding in the aftermath of trauma and tragedy. So really looking at how do people move on and find resilience in the aftermath of despair. And they're not stories that are all sort of, everything's great, so let's be hopeful about everything. But they're really stories that are honing in on the resilience as opposed to only covering trauma and tragedy and problems. And did a lot of work there around solutions journalism, helping journalists to tell more stories of solutions instead of only focusing on problems. So while I was there, I did start to think about, how this would relate to stories around health and communication. And it ended up playing a bigger factor in my work years after the fact. But did a lot of work there, and as executive director, learned so many different skills beyond journalism. So while I still had a foot in journalism, I was also learning about event planning and fundraising and program management. So that was really helpful in terms of just building those skill sets. And then, for some reason, it's being finicky. While I was at Images and Voices of Hope, I had my first child, my daughter Madeline, this year. She's 7. Later had my son Tupper, who's 5. But my children have really helped me to think about this idea of living life in the form of a question. Always cultivating that curiosity, which I think is really important when you're in the field of communications. And at this point in my career, I was really beginning to think about, what do I want to do? Where do I want to go from here? I always knew I wanted to be in journalism, but I felt like I wanted to be doing something slightly different. And so I thought about my career up to that point and how it had really been largely at the intersection of journalism and training. So I decided I wanted to go into academia. At the time, my husband and I had just moved from St. Petersburg, Florida to Austin, Texas. And so I connected with some people at UT Austin, got a job there through my connections at Poynter. So connections are always helpful. Roy got me the job at Poynter, and then someone from Poynter helped me get the job at UT. And while I was at UT, I ended up coming on board as the associate director at the Knight Center for Journalism, which is a training and outreach program for journalists in Latin America, but also globally. So we offer free journalism events and training opportunities, and we have a trilingual digital news magazine geared toward covering freedom of the press issues in Latin America. So I wear lots of different hats there, do many different things because it's a relatively small organization that does a whole lot. But it was while I was there that I really kind of fostered this love for teaching and ended up becoming part-time faculty in the School of Journalism. And as you can see here, this is a picture of me and some of my students, and it's via Zoom, right? So in 2020, after I'd been at the Knight Center for about 3 years, the pandemic, of course, hit. And that really pivoted a lot of the work I was doing and changed a lot of my focus at the Knight Center in particular. And when COVID-19 struck, we realized we really need to do something to help journalists and communicators figure out how to cover this global story that is constantly evolving and ever-changing. And so at the Knight Center, we have these massive open online courses, which we call MOOCs. So they're free courses that we offer to journalists in different languages. And we put this one together quite quickly in May of 2020. And we brought on board a science journalist named Mary McKenna to teach this 4-week course in which we were really helping journalists to figure out what is the pandemic, who are some good sources they could turn to, how can they sift through misinformation and not spread it, how can they look for these reliable sources, how can they figure out what different communities are needing at any given point in time in terms of the news coverage that they're looking for. And so we created this MOOC, which was really quite influential. We partnered with the World Health Organization and the United Nations Development Program and UNESCO to put this together. And it ended up reaching over 9,000 students from 162 countries. And when I see students, I mostly mean professional working communicators. So it had a huge global reach. And what was great about the course is we also had sort of these discussion forums, which created these peer-to-peer learning communities where journalists could come together and talk about all the different challenges that they were facing and seek guidance from each other and also from the course instructor. And so then about a year later, in April of 2021, we held a second MOOC, which was specifically focused on the vaccines because we knew that that was a real critical need to offer journalists training in this area. And so we put together a second MOOC with mostly the same partners. This time we also partnered with the European Union. And this one attracted about 4,400 students from 160 countries, which shows that there was a real need for training, right, around vaccine coverage. So we looked at inequities in terms of distribution with vaccines. We looked at the different types of misinformation coming out around the vaccines and how not to continue perpetuating that. We looked at how do you fact check stories about the vaccine, how do you localize stories about it. So it was really instrumental to be able to have this training opportunity for journalists. And I was sort of the one behind the scenes, putting all these together, working with the funders, working with the instructors, helping them to all come to fruition. And in addition to the MOOCs, we also had a bunch of webinars that we held to just offer some quicker training. It's a bit of a time investment to take part in a course, right, that takes place over 4 weeks. So we offer these webinars, which were typically about 90 minutes to 3 hours long. And we brought in subject matter experts, not only journalists, but also medical doctors, epidemiologists, others who could really help journalists to understand the fuller scope of the pandemic. And so collectively, these webinars had a great reach. We also partnered with the MIT's Knight Center or Knight Journalism program. And so they have a really great science communication program, and we worked with them on these webinars. And they were translated into 13 different languages, right? So we tried to make them as accessible as possible, knowing that this was an unprecedented global story. And in doing all of this training, I helped put together this COVID-19 hub, essentially. We got some funding to put together this hub, which is a collection of all these different resources that we have been putting out since the pandemic started. And we're continuing to try to update it, knowing that even though hopefully the worst of the pandemic is past, it's still not gone, and that there needs to be evolving coverage of it. And as this was all transpiring, I was also getting my MFA in nonfiction writing from Goucher College. It was an online program. It was supposed to be low residency, but it was no residency because of the pandemic. I got my MFA because journalism is one of those weird professions where you actually don't really need a master's, but it's great to have one. And that was even true as a part-time faculty member at UT. It wasn't required, but I knew I wanted to continue working in academia, so I wanted my terminal degree. I also knew I wanted to write a book, which was a lifelong dream of mine. And so with this program, I was able to sort of work on a thesis that laid the foundation for what would become this book that I'm now working on. And the book is about my own experiences with anorexia, which I suffered from when I was an adolescent. And it looks at the ongoingness of recovery and the nuances of recovery from the disorder. And so while I was in the program, I was working on this book. I also happened to get COVID before the vaccine had come out. And this was in September of 2020. And at the time, I lost my taste and smell, right? So that was quite challenging as someone who had suffered with anorexia pretty acutely as an adolescent. And I found that as I lost my taste, I was triggered in some ways and that I didn't have a desire to eat. I found myself restricting food intake. And I said, there's got to be something to this. I was looking online, trying to see if there were stories about this, and there really wasn't. And after 6 weeks, once I got my taste back, I bounced back and I was okay. But I said, there has to be someone writing about this. So I pitched a piece to the New York Times about it and ended up getting published. And this was happening around the same time that news organizations were starting to cover eating disorders more. According to one study, there was a 38% increase in eating disorder symptoms during COVID and a 48% increase in hospitalizations due to eating disorders. So journalists, I think, were really beginning to realize that this was a huge story, as well as just mental health issues in general during the pandemic. So I saw this as an opportunity to start writing more about eating disorders and to really help use my journalistic skills to inform people during the pandemic. So I wrote a piece recently about what media coverage get wrong when they cover eating disorders, and have also written a series of other personal essays for Washington Post, Tampa Bay Times, Dallas Morning News, just really trying to help people to understand the complexities of eating disorders, which can be a bit enigmatic for people who haven't experienced them or know somebody who's experienced them. And all as this is happening, I've been working on the book and writing these essays, and I ended up creating this international survey as part of my reporting for the book. And it got about 600 responses from people in 43 countries. And one thing I was struck by is just the number of people who said that COVID-19 was a contributing factor to their eating disorder. So some people said it either contributed to their disorder or it caused them to relapse, right? So this is just a couple snippets of quotes from the survey. But I found this to be really important, and it really motivated me to want to continue writing and telling stories about eating disorders, particularly at this moment in time when there is more attention put on mental health, largely because of the pandemic and its effects on people. And so I've been working on the book. As I mentioned, it's been a lifelong dream for quite some time. It's gone through different iterations. I wrote a first draft of it after graduating from PC, which I've since discarded, but it still was helpful in terms of just thinking about the book. And while I was in grad school, I got a literary agent, and I've been working with her and created my proposal, which I never do book proposals or like 85-page documents. Worked my book proposal with the help of my agent, started sending it out to different publishers. It was about a 1.5 year long process with many, many rejections. And I mentioned that because there will be times where you're going to get lots of rejections, but just stick with it. I persevered and ended up finally getting a book deal from Simon & Schuster via their imprint. It's called Simon Element. So got the book deal in December, and it actually was just announced last week. So I'm happy to be able to share it with you all here today. And the book industry, it takes a while for these things to get published. So I have about a 1.5 years left to write the book, and then it'll probably be out in 2025. But just really, it's helped me to think a lot about the importance of journalism and communication during COVID-19. And so I think that this work that we do is really noble and important. And I'm really happy to be able to talk more about it during the Q&A portion of the session. So thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm honored to be here with Mallary at the Lavoie Memorial Lecture. As Dr. Overly said, my name is Brianna Abbott, and I'm a health and science reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and I'm also a Providence College graduate from 2017. And I wanted to start off my presentation with this picture, which I took in March of 2021 after I returned to the newsroom at the Wall Street Journal offices in Manhattan after being away for about a year after the pandemic, forced all of us to work remotely. And I was coming back to clear out my desk because we were switching to a hybrid model, so no one's desk was anyone's own anymore, so you had to come in and get all your stuff. And so I walked into this newsroom covered in dust, and sitting at my desk was this yellowing stack of newspapers. And on top of the stack of newspapers was an article that I had written about this pandemic that was just declared a public health emergency. And I thought it was very eerie and apocalyptic at the time. So I took a photo, and now I'm presenting this photo to all of you. And so before we get into all of that, I'd love to start with a bit of my background. So when I came to PC as a freshman in 2013, I did not want to be a journalist. It was not on my radar. I wanted to write novels, and I came in sort of declared as an English major. But I'd also always loved science and had taken AP chemistry in high school, and it was one of my favorite classes. So I lobbied to join the chemistry major's intro to chemistry class as an English major, in case that was something that I also wanted to pursue. And I figured at the very least it would help me fulfill my science requirement. And so I eventually just kept taking classes on both tracks and figured eventually I would choose a route, either English or chemistry. I would have to pick one. And I was never fully able to. And so I ended up double majoring in both, and I split my time between the Cowell office, like Mallary. I was the editor of the opinion section, and the old Almag building where I did analytical chemistry research with Dr. Breen. I'm also very jealous of this new building, by the way. This is beautiful. If you've ever been in the old Almag, you are lucky. So coming to the end of my time at PC, I still quite wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I thought about getting my MFA and writing novels. I thought about getting a PhD and doing research. And then with some help from Dr. Overly, I sort of realized that writing about science was a job that you could actually have. And I thought, oh, great, that seems like the job for me. And so after that, I went to NYU for graduate school in journalism. We didn't have a communications minor at PC at the time, and I felt like I really needed to sort of up my journalism skills if I wanted to do it professionally. And so I did the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program at NYU. And so it's science journalism focused, and there are programs like this across the country sort of hidden within bigger journalism departments. And so I did that for about a year and a half, and it taught me basic journalism skills. And I took classes like medical reporting, environmental reporting, and data journalism. And I was also required to do internships. And so I ended up writing about autism for researchers and families. I spent a summer at Scholastic where I wrote about math for kids. And I also had a 3-month stint at Nature Medicine. And so after that, I graduated and I landed an internship at the Wall Street Journal, and I've been there ever since. And that was sort of the beginning of 2019. And so what do you actually do as a science journalist? So as a science journalist, it is my job to keep on top of the news and trends in whatever field that I'm covering, whether it's cancer or infectious diseases, anything like that. So I often start by reading advanced copies of scientific papers that are set to come out in places like JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, to see if there's anything that might be interesting to a general audience. I also attend press conferences and, get reports from companies and universities and things like that. And then what I do is I also spend a lot of time talking to researchers and doctors and patients and take, everything that I've learned. I figure out what's new and interesting, and then I explain it in a way that's sort of accessible and shows why it's important. And so sometimes I am writing about cats and studies that have to do with them. Sometimes I am writing about measles. Sometimes you get a press release from the New York State Department of Health saying that there was a polio case in New York for the first time in 10 years, and you have to drop everything that you are doing and get a story out within an hour. So what I do really depends on the day. We're usually juggling a couple of different stories at once. And some days is all writing, and some days is just researching and talking to sources. And so while I was at the journal, like I said, I started as an intern. I started, covering measles outbreaks, writing sort of one-off pieces. When the vaping-related illnesses started happening in the summer of 2019, I was put on that as one of the lead reporters, in part because our veteran public health reporter was out of the country at the time, so it fell to me. And I did that for a couple of months, and we sort of eventually realized that was due to vitamin E acetate and unregulated THC products, even though a lot of the attention was still on jewel and flavors. And so the evidence was going in a different direction of the conversation. And as a science journalist, you have to sort of take all of that together and sort of accurately explain what's going on. And then after that, that sort of widened down, and I got put on a news story. And that was an emerging respiratory virus that was spreading in Wuhan, China. The first time I wrote about it was January of 2020, and I had been a full-time reporter in a newsroom for less than a year at that point. And soon I was starting to get questions from friends at restaurants and hockey games about this mysterious virus that was, spreading on the other side of the world. But it became pretty apparent that it was spreading here too, and that we didn't quite know where it was. And so I went to stop at this article here, which happened on a day where we were on a CDC press call, and they told us that the COVID test that they were sending out to the state health departments wasn't working for some reason. One of the reagents wasn't behaving consistently, so they had to remake it and, send it back out to the labs. And it's actually surprisingly difficult to describe what a reagent is to someone who has never been in a lab before. It took a really long time. We came up with the word chemical substance, which felt very weird as a chemist to say. But like part of the job is really taking things or concepts that are like secondhand, you don't even think about it to a scientist, and then explain what it is to everybody else. So it doesn't have to be perfect as long as it gets the point across and it's not wrong. And something else that happened around this time too is I started doing more reporting on COVID testing. And this is where my science background was really an advantage because I already knew what a PCR machine was. I had used one before in a lab. And when they said that, in some of the negative controls on the tests, they were starting to get a small positive signal, I knew what that meant sort of without them having to walk me through it. I still asked them to walk me through it so I could sort of explain it to people. But the fact that I sort of had that background knowledge going in sort of helped me build trust with these sources as someone who could sort of get the science right, which was sort of incredibly important to them and to us. And so, and people kept having questions about the science, and things just escalated very quickly. And people had a lot of questions, and we did not have a lot of answers, but we had to respond quickly and get the best information out there that we could. And a lot of that also happened within our own newsroom because a lot more people were put on the story that didn't necessarily know anything about science. And so part of my job too was reading other stories or helping other reporters with the science parts of it. At one point, we had to send around a memo to the entire newsroom explaining the difference between SARS-CoV-2, the virus, and COVID-19, the disease, and what that meant. And we were also, reading different studies that other reporters were sending us saying, hey, is this interesting? Is this important? Should we cover it? And we were sort of, the team that was making a lot of those calls. And another thing that I had to do was start writing about the government and the CDC itself and sort of holding them accountable when they got something wrong or if the guidelines didn't make sense with what we knew about how the virus was spreading. And that is pretty new for me, just because when I was covering measles or vaping, the CDC's word was pretty much law, and you didn't question them or sort of need to question it. But now, we were in a new era where I had to learn how to explain how and why the CDC was making these decisions and whether or not outside scientists agreed with them. And so that was definitely a new concept for me. And, at the same time that this was happening, I, like a lot of people, left New York in March of 2020 to go back to my parents' house. And so I was doing a lot of this accountability journalism from the floor of my childhood bedroom with stuffed animals and cartoons in the wall. And I'd have to move my Zoom screen over so the background looked professional. So it was a weird time. And then when we came back to New York too, at a certain point, I was going back and forth and quarantining in between for 2 weeks. I was also in a cramped New York City apartment with 3 other journalists, just sort of reporting out the story for my friends. And there wasn't a lot to do. And so, we would do these late night yoga sessions to detach and try and calm down. And as soon as it was over, I would run to my phone to make sure I didn't miss any news or an email from my editor, because the job was really full time, for months, writing multiple stories a day, just sort of trying to keep up with the incessant pace of the news. And then, things got better. The vaccine got here and we covered that rollout, and some of the data really started to improve and things were changing. And unfortunately, the virus was also changing. And that's when you started to see a lot of these variants of concerns come around. And that was its own challenge, because a lot of the science that we had painstakingly learned over the past year didn't always necessarily apply to the new variant, that we had sort of re-asked all of these basic questions all over again. And anytime a new variant emerged, our editors would be like, are the symptoms new? Is it more severe than before? And we would have to say, we've had this thing for like a week. We had no idea. The science, unfortunately, does not move that quickly where you are just going to immediately get an answer, but it's going as fast as it can. So a lot of that is just bridging the gap between researchers and people who don't necessarily understand the pace of how science normally functions. And so we kept reporting and we kept writing. And something else that we really focused on too was the human impact of the pandemic, which was really the most important thing. And so a lot of that work involved, talking to families whose loved ones had passed away from COVID, or people who still had debilitating lingering symptoms months later. I talked to principals who were trying to, keep kids in their classroom, but also keep them healthy. And, people who were just doctors and nurses who were witnessing all of this inside of an ICU. And that work was probably the most draining, but it was also the most important out of everything that we were doing. And we, started reporting on some of the knock-off effects, like for things on mental health and learning loss, and all of that sort of became part of the COVID story as well that we had to cover. And, like I said, the situation is a lot better now. I went from writing 3 or 4 stories a week or sometimes a day to 3 or 4 stories a month. And now I'm able to write about, other things. But my coworker Sarah and I wrote this story about a week ago on the 3rd anniversary of the World Health Organization saying that this was a pandemic. And we sort of talked to a bunch of researchers about the unknown questions that we still have. Because while things are a lot better, COVID is still a new virus. And the story is changing, but it's not over. And so it's something that we're still working on as the story and the science continue. Thank everyone for having me. And I think now we're going to invite Lauren and Samantha up here as well and do our Q&A. So I'm excited to talk to you guys about that more. Hello all. We are the student panelists for the lecture today. So my name is Lauren Peck. I am a senior chemistry major, and my own experience with science and communication involves more on the research side. I'm presenting the research that I do in the department with Dr. Maria Carroll. I've presented in the classroom and at national conferences, and this has led me to plan my future career. And next year I will be attending graduate school to pursue a PhD in chemistry. And that's my little okay, so my name is Sam. I'm also a senior. I'm a biology major and a sociology minor. And my experience in science communication, for most of college, I thought I would go to med school, and about a year ago, I realized that is not what I wanted to do, so I scrambled and was able to get an internship at a life sciences trade organization called Rhode Island Bio, and there I helped carry out their mission of promoting the life sciences with communication, education, and advocacy. Well, it was my first taste of communications with my knowledge of science, and I loved it, so after graduation, I plan on doing a master's in science for life science and technology, and we'll see where that takes me. But that being said, I'll start us off with the first question, and it is, what advice would you share with recent graduates looking to embark in the field of communications?
That's a great question. So I think communications is such a great field in that it is relevant to so many different disciplines and professions. Every profession and organization needs people who are good communicators. And I think that there's so many different modes of communication that are always evolving, whether we're talking about podcasts or social media or broadcast TV, right? But I think that good writing is integral to any sort of communications field. And so I think being able to really use your writing skills and continue to hone those will be really important for those of you going up into communication. I would say too that as you think about your work in communications, think about what your values are as a communicator. That's something that we don't necessarily think about when we're first starting out in the field, but I think it can be really important. And when I was at the Poynter Institute, I started to really appreciate the values of transparency and good ethics and truth, which have continued to be foundational to the work that I do. So really looking at what are these organizations, what do they stand for, do they align with my values? And lastly, there's something I just wanted to mention, which is something I tell my own communication students who are about to graduate and go into the field. And that is something that I like to call the 5 C's, which is curiosity, creativity, courage, creative thinking, and cultural competency. Those are really important. And that last one, cultural competency, is this idea that different communities have different experiences with the journalists in particular, but also with communicators in general. So there's some communities, for instance, that maybe feel as though the media only covers them when something bad happens, right? And so part of being a good journalist and a good communicator is being transparent about the type of work that we do, really trying to reach diverse communities, and really letting people know, okay, I'm a journalist, right? I'm going to interview you for this story, which is about XYZ. Just because I'm interviewing you doesn't mean the whole story is necessarily going to be about you, but your perspective will enrich my understanding of the story, right? And being really transparent about the work that we do as journalists, as communicators, I think can go a long way toward building trust. So it's something I would just encourage you to keep in mind as you pursue a career in communications.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Mallory. And I think I'll just add that if this is something you're thinking about, and like, especially if you're coming from a science background and you're interested in communications, but you might not necessarily have done a lot of it outside of, your civ curriculum, my best advice is to just like find a place to do it and jump in, because it can be a little daunting if you don't have, professional writing samples, which is like what a lot of publications ask for. But like, there are a lot of different like internships and fellowships and looking for people with a science background to try communication. So I would just like go for it and get your foot in the door and see if you like it. And then like clips, which is just like journalism lingo for like a piece of writing, like you get clips. So like once you get one, it's easier to get the next one. So you just have to sort of take that leap to get you started.
Thank you. So our next question is if there were any particular faculty or Dominicans or staff who influenced or inspired you for your time here at PC.
Yeah, definitely. There were a lot, but one who comes to mind is Richie Kless. I know he retired a couple of years ago, but he was the advisor of the Cowl. So he was someone who I spent a lot of time talking to when I was trying to figure out how to deal with challenging situations. And he was just a great sounding board. So I learned a lot from him. I ran into him at the airport a couple of years ago in New Orleans, of all places. I got to reconnect with him there and have kept in touch on and off throughout the years. So him, and then also Guido. He was also someone who I turned to a lot throughout my years at PC, and he taught me a lot about providence, this idea that God directs everything toward its rightful end. And I was thinking about him recently because I was listening to this podcast with the author Elizabeth Gilbert, and she was talking about memoir writing. And she said that basically anyone over the age of 35 or 40 could write a memoir with the same title, which is not what I had planned. And it made me think of this idea of providence and the fact that God writes straight and crooked lines, and life doesn't always happen as planned. So I keep a lot of his teachings in mind as I go through life.
Yeah, and I would say I mentioned, two of mine in my presentation, and they're also in this room, Dr. Breen and Dr. Overly. Dr. Breen was my principal investigator, and Dr. Overly was my advisor, and I would go to them all the time for, career advice, research, all of that sort of thing. Dr. Overly and I would swap book recommendations sometimes. And I remember this journalism story related to Dr. Breen, actually, where I was on the Cowl and I was still like writing, half editing, and I wrote this like very scathing piece about how like Almad was very old and like we were getting a brand new business center, and I was very bitter that Almad was very old. And he was and it was like, all plenty and things like that. And then later, I got a call from someone in administration, and they like brought me into their office. It was very scary, and they were like, "So we're actually designing a new science building. You seem to tell." And sure, talking about Dr. Breen, and he was like, "Yeah, you need to like ask people things to write about it." And I was like, you know what? That is good advice. And journalism school helped with that, but my professors helped with that too.
Thank you so much for both of those responses. Now we'd like to ask, in general, how do journalists decide when communication is important, and how do you make it understandable to the larger society?
You want to go first since you're really immersed in?
Sure. So how to decide what is important. So first of all, it really depends on your audience. So I've written for like a range of different publications as an intern, and like what you would write for the audience of Spectrum or Scholastic is different than what you would write for the audience of the Wall Street Journal. So like you really have to know who you are trying to communicate to is sort of the first question there. Like at the Wall Street Journal, for example, we're a like business professional publication, but it's also a general audience. And so we have a lot of people who don't know anything about science, but we also have a lot of doctors. And so you have to, be simple enough that anybody can understand it, but then you also have to be right, because you have a lot of doctors reading your work, and if something is a little off, they will email you and tell you. So it's, it really does depend. And it also depends on like what's going on in the world. Because there was a period of time where with COVID, we were covering every piece of news, like every study that came out, every test that got EUA authorized, like we were writing stories constantly. And now those things are still happening, but we're writing about it a lot less because the pace of it is not as important anymore. It's still important, but you can, take a step back and not write everything that comes through. So that's something that you really learn with the time, but it's really about your audience, and it's also about, what's going on in the world at the time.
Yeah, I second that. Knowing your audience is a really huge part of it. And I think, too, in terms of making it more comprehensible and understandable, I think that decoding jargon is really important. I'm sure you can attest to this, Brianna. Sometimes when you're talking with people who are very immersed in their subject matter expertise, they may speak in very jargony terms. And this applies to so many different fields, law, science, police officers, right? Just talking jargony terms. So I think decoding that is really important. The chapter that I'm working on right now for my book is about the neurobiology of eating disorders, which has been fascinating to learn about, but it's also been incredibly challenging, right? And the two most important questions I've had to ask are, can you help me explain this, and why? Right? So never being afraid to ask those questions. If you've done your research, you should have the confidence to go into an interview knowing that it's okay to ask these tough questions and to ask for help understanding something that's complicated. Because if you don't understand it, then you're not going to be able to write about it, communicate about it in a way that other people can understand. I will also say that in terms of making something more understandable, it can be really helpful to have people in your stories, right? So kind of people-centered stories that are just bogged down with tons of data and numbers can be really hard to sift through, and they're ultimately less relatable. So anytime that you can include a scientist, right, who's doing really interesting work, or you can create analogies, right? Anything along those lines that can help make the information more palatable is ultimately going to make it easier to understand.
Awesome. Thank you for that advice. So our next question is, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the media outlets across the world were relaying different scientific communication and safety protocols. So as journalists, how do you handle the miscommunication that happens, and how do you tackle contradicting sources to get the information out to the public in an expedited manner and make scientific jargon understandable?
So really important question, right? I'm thinking of something that John Quinn, who I mentioned in my presentation, had said, and he said, get it first, but first get it right, which I think is really important to keep in mind. This idea that ultimately we are truth tellers, we are trying to disseminate information that is correct. And so I think that understanding that is really important. and also owning up to our mistakes. So, I mean, the reality is that no matter how hard we try to get the information right, journalists are still going to make mistakes. And I think being transparent and open about that is really important. And a lot of people don't know, but most news organizations have a correction section, right, where they post corrections, and they're very open about that, and they publish about it so that it doesn't look like they're trying to cover up some mistakes. So I think doing everything we can to get it right is ultimately super important, but also acknowledging when we get it wrong is important as well, and being really transparent about that. I think, too, that there, a lot of times, as you mentioned, are contradictory sources. And I think that as journalists, we need to do our research and figure out, okay, what is sort of the hard data and information that needs to be communicated. But sometimes we also need to recognize when there are contrarian viewpoints and when there are people who are in disagreement, right? And being able to communicate that and say, Stacey Jones said this, but Tamika Smith said that, right? And being able to sort of show the different sides of the story. I don't believe that as journalists we can tell all sides of the story, because there's an infinite number of sides to any given story, and it's never as simple as he said, she said. But I think being able to relay different sides of the story and be inclusive when it comes to that is really important. And then also provide the context that we gathered through our reporting. And provide that context in the story so that we can really expand people's knowledge and understanding of the topic at hand.
Definitely. I would agree with all of that. And I know that that was a really hard thing for us at the beginning of the pandemic, down to like very early when it became no longer feasible for me to track the individual COVID cases in Excel sheet. We had to like figure out which source we were even getting like our COVID case number from. We were like, do we use Johns Hopkins University? Do we use the CDC, which is slower? And so we had to have that conversation internally. And then eventually, like, the important thing in that situation was you just like pick one. And that it is really hard. And I really sort of echo Mallary was saying that like you have to start with the data, and then different folks who are even experts in the field. It was something like COVID where the science isn't really in yet. Like, you're gonna have different opinions. And so like it's important to talk to a range of people and then sort of discuss the range in opinions for either, you know, what might happen or what this certain thing means. And that's still going on even today with things like long COVID. And so it's important to sort of show those sides, but like only sides where that the data sort of supports. Because there are some, you know, non-data-based opinions that, you know, end up not panning out. And then you have to sort of like leave those behind. But even with, you know, an area where the data could go either way, that's when you have to be really transparent and say, you know, we don't know. It could be A, it could be B.
Yeah, that's great. And as you were talking, it made me think about two things that we did in those MOOCs that I mentioned. And one was this idea of pre-bunking, right? So journalists are always trying to sort of like debunk disinformation or misinformation. A part of it was this idea of pre-bunking and really anticipating questions or skepticism that people might have, say, about the vaccine. And thinking about what are some of the questions people might have, how could we answer those, again, on the front end of those. And the other thing too was really not perpetuating this information by sort of restating it. I came across this headline that said, "Do miscarriages or does the vaccine cause miscarriages?" Right? And the article was aimed at trying to sort of debunk this myth, but in doing so is also kind of reiterating the same misinformation. And so trying to be really careful about that, because sometimes in doing that, we can entertain these hypotheses that really kind of reinforce falsehoods. So trying to walk that line can be tricky, but it's something that journalists are always having conversations about.
Yeah, if you have a headline that's a question and the answer is no, you should probably pick a different headline. That's sort of a rule of the journal then.
Yeah, I like that.
Thank you. So now 3 years since the start of the pandemic, how do you feel the field of communications and journalism has changed, specifically regarding the intersection of science and health news and information?
Yeah, so I would say one thing is that health and science news is now no longer relegated to the science reporter or the health reporter. I think science and health are topics that so many journalists are covering now, especially since the pandemic hit. And I think, too, that the field of communications and journalism become a lot more aware of mental health and the effect that the pandemic has had on mental health issues like eating disorders, depression, suicide, anxiety. And so I've seen a lot more of these organizations pay more attention to those particular topics since the pandemic started, which I think is really important because it does help to reduce some of the stigma around some of these mental health issues. So I think, too, a lot of times those stories offer up points of relatability, and they help us realize that we're not alone, which was really important during the pandemic when we were isolated and we're alone. So I think stories and communications can really help to bring people together, and we've seen more of that happen during the pandemic. I would also say, too, that just since the pandemic, there has been, I think, more attention drawn to news literacy as an idea of trying to help people understand how to understand the news and journalism. Years ago, you would read a newspaper and there was a very distinct news section and opinion section. Now everybody sees stuff online, right? And so there's less understanding of what is an opinion piece versus what's a news piece. And news organizations, since the pandemic started in particular, have really been trying to make more concerted efforts to create very specific labels on news stories and opinion stories to help people to understand that, okay, this is a commentary piece. This is not a reporter who is just sort of spouting off opinions and trying to seem neutral, right? Because I've seen so much more of that, this idea of there being fake news. And so I think really helping people to understand more about the news they're consuming has been important. And it's also put more pressure on journalists for the better, I think, to really be transparent about the type of stories they're telling and labeling them in such a way that people understand, okay, this is opinion, this is news, this is feature, this is sports, whatever it might be.
No, definitely. There has been such more of an emphasis on science and health reporting going forward. Like, for instance, sort of before the pandemic, the science and health team was like underneath the corporate umbrella at the Wall Street Journal. And then now we've like branched out and have become like our own bureau, which is new, and that's sort of remaining in place. We hired a lot more reporters, or our team is bigger than what we had earlier. So there's definitely more of an emphasis on science and health communication. And like we said, sort of the stories that we tell and the differentiating between, you know, science news and an opinion, which is very important. And yeah.
Thank you. So now that Providence College offers a minor in communication, how do you feel this new opportunity can create a path towards journalism easier for PC graduates?
I think that that's definitely going to be useful. So I love DeKalb. I love my time there. I learned a lot when I was there. But because I was on the opinion section, sort of like we talked about before, I didn't really sort of get those basic journalism skills while I was there. It was mostly just sort of like writing essays. And so I felt like I personally really benefited from graduate school, where I learned a lot of those journalism basics. But so I'm really excited now that PC does have this communications minor, so you can start doing that stuff a bit earlier to see if it's something that you might want to do for a career, and also sort of have those basic skills to start out with. So yeah, I think it definitely, I don't know if I don't know if I would have had room in my schedule, but I probably would have tried to fit in a couple of classes. So definitely really excited about that.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think that it's so important for PC to have a communications minor, and I hope it becomes a major. I think it's just critical. I really wish that I had that when I was at PC. A lot of times people ask me, well, why did you go to a school that didn't have a journalism major if you wanted to be a journalist? And I really loved PC, and I also was of the belief that I didn't necessarily need to major in journalism to become a journalist. I really wanted to be able to get a liberal arts education. But having the practical experience of the cowl and then various internships was critical and super important. But I think if I had had that as a student, it would have given me more of a leg up, and I would have been even that much more prepared to go into the field of journalism. And I think that being able to study communications and have this communications minor is really important in terms of learning things like good ethics, learning things about fact checking, copy editing, how do you effectively communicate clearly and concisely. All these things that we don't necessarily learn until we're in the field. I think being able to learn those in college is just incredibly important, and it's going to really pave the path, I think, for a lot more PC students to go into the field of communications.
Well, thank you so much, Brianna and Mallary, for sharing your experiences and giving us so much advice. So now I would like to open up Q&A to the audience. We ask that when you answer questions, you speak into the microphones in front of you. There should be a button in the front, and that will turn the light on, and it'll be green. And then once you're done asking your question, you just hit the gray button, and the light should go off. But yeah.
So, you folks didn't really talk about your English major. What's the one thing you do have clearly in college?
Sorry, Dr. Graber, we will definitely do that. So I love my English major at PC in the creative writing program. And something that I was just sort of thinking about is, like, you encounter a lot of journalists who are really good at reporting and getting information and that sort of thing. And then they have to write a big narrative piece, and like their writing skills aren't as strong, right? So like journalism is a lot about telling a story really, really well. And that really hooks the reader. And I did feel like when I went into grad school, I did have, not only did I have science, I had the leg up from the creative writing side, because, you know, I could write anecdotal leads to stories that focus on characters. And that is really sort of what grabs people in journalism, because the human stories are most important. And, you know, and it also just teaches you to sort of read and analyze stories, which is incredibly important and part of our job as well. So I'd say that my creative writing background was just incredibly useful, and still is for what I'm doing now.
Yes, sorry, Dr. Graber. No, I love being an English major and had Dr. Graber as a professor. And I think, being an English major seemed like a natural fit, knowing that I wanted to pursue a career that was writing related. And I was also, my friend Colleen, who graduated with me, was a fellow English major, English and Spanish major. Thanks, Colleen, for being here. But I loved being an English major. And I think what I learned in my time as an English major here was that to become a better writer, you need to read, write, and talk about reading and writing. And those three things I was able to really do as an English major here. And when I left PC, I really missed that third component, the talking about reading and writing, because I did so much of that as a student at PC. And being able to engage in conversations about William Faulkner's prose, or, you know, just all these different writers, and thinking about, okay, how can we dissect this and think about what the writer was trying to do? Having those conversations was so important in terms of expanding my thinking around the written word. And when I went to get my MFA, everything that I had learned at PC, it was incredibly helpful in terms of being able to then apply that during my MFA, where we were doing a lot of the same thing, just reading lots of prose and trying to figure out, what does this mean, right? Why did the writer approach it in this way? So yes, even though there wasn't a journalism major, I think English served me just as well.
As journalists, how do you feel social media impacted the whole COVID-19 news environment? Because we know there was a lot of misinformation, but we also know there was a lot of valid information. So I'm just wondering, as the perspective of a journalist, did you feel that you were putting out fires caused by social media?
Sure, that's a great question. And sort of like you alluded to in the question, there were definitely benefits that I got from it and serious issues with it. So I sort of, at the beginning of the pandemic, I followed I feel like the only people on Twitter anymore are like journalists and academics and stuff like that. It's like its own little worlds at this point, and politicians and things like that. So I followed a lot of epidemiologists and public health officials. And so that was really great because I would like wake up in the morning. It's like something I would do as I was like baking coffee. I would scroll through and you would like quickly get the reaction on a piece of news from a lot of different experts at the same time because they were just tweeting it out. And obviously you would never use that in an actual article, but like you'd be like, oh, this person had an interesting tweet on Twitter. Let me reach out to them and have a conversation with them. And sometimes you would really find sources that way. So in that sense, it was a really useful reporting tool. And at the same time, there were a lot of ideas that were getting tweeted out that were misinformation and not helpful. And so sometimes there was something that would take off in that ecosystem that you would eventually have to bring up or debunk in a certain way, or at least look into that wasn't necessarily like that during earlier like health emergencies. And so it was definitely a double-edged sword. And I don't spend nearly as much time on Twitter as I used to. I sort of have put that away. But yeah, it's there were definitely pros and some serious cons as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm thinking back to when I started at the Poynter Institute, and my first story there was about Twitter. And the first line of the story was, "I never thought I'd be a Twitterer who Twitter tweets," because the word tweeted wasn't around then. But at the time, the story was about how journalists could use Twitter as a reporting and writing tool. And at the time, the New York Times had 400 Twitter followers, and now they have 55 million, right? And I remember people emailing me saying, "Why are you writing about this tool that is never going to help journalists and that's never going to get big?" And of course, here we are where it's huge, even though some people have left Twitter, understandably, but social media in general is huge and it's a beast. And it has, for sure, I think, helped journalists in a lot of ways, but it has also contributed to kind of the madness of covering the pandemic. I am a fan of social media. I particularly like Twitter, and I use that for a lot of sort of reporting purposes. It's a way that I find sources, and it's a way that I keep up to date with a lot of things I'm interested in, particularly with regard to eating disorders and the reporting that I'm doing for the book. But I also am disheartened when I hear people talk about misinformation, and then when I ask, well, where did you find that? Well, it was on social media, or someone I follow on Twitter said it. And so I think, again, this comes back to the news literacy and this idea that we need to understand where the news and information that we're getting is coming from and who it's coming from, and recognize that for many people, they may just only follow this one very biased person on social media who is not a trained journalist, but is just some person who's spouting off information that may or may not be true and that has no reporting behind it. But the layperson may not know that, right? Because they may not understand what a journalist does versus what this, communicator does on social media. So I think there's a lot of sort of education that needs to happen. And I think that it's all the more reason why journalists in particular should be transparent about the work that they do and the amount of reporting that goes into the stories that we tell. We're not just sort of spouting off falsehoods. We're really doing a lot of in-depth reporting to help inform communities and educate them. So I think that social media has created a lot of opportunities for us, but also challenged us in new ways and created new opportunities to be really radically transparent about the work we do.
Any other? Oh, Dr. Check.
First, a little ad. Anybody with a Providence.edu email can get a free subscription to the Wall Street Journal College Library's website. If you go there and search for Brianna's tape, you can get a notification every time she publishes a story. Now, great posts about her book coming out. I know it's relatively early in her career, but is there a subject you've come across that you would love to dive into and either write a feature story or a longer piece? It sounds like you're always moving, but do you have the time to think about what are you really interested in from society?
Yeah, so that's a great question, the nurse track. Yeah, so like I said at the very beginning, I always wanted to be a novelist. So I would love to, write books one day or something a bit longer. The Wall Street Journal word length is pretty short, just like as a publication. So like our longest articles are about like 2,000 words, which for some other publications is like a short study story. So that can make it hard sometimes. But yeah, now I am doing a lot more reporting on cancer, which I really love because it combines that like very hard science that I really like with very human stories that I like telling. And so it's sort of like a great combination of all of my interests. So it would be something in that bucket. I don't think I would write a pandemic book. I should prefer too many of those. Yeah, so who knows? That it's sort of, it's on the to-do list, but I don't have like a firm topic yet.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. So we would like to conclude the question and answer portion of this lecture, and then welcome Teresa Lavoie to.
Thank you. That was great. Let's do another. And with our time today and for preparing such great presentations and for the student panelists too to take your time and effort to do this. I know it's not easy, especially on probably one of the first sort of nice days of spring and moving forward. I also want to thank the staff here who really worked so hard to put this together. It took many hours of discussions and thinking about themes and what can we do and how to really extend this lecture series to scientists and other majors here to say sort of how can you use your skills that you get here in Providence, not just in the sciences, but in, your English major, if you're an arts honors major, how to synthesize all of those and, get a career that you really love out of this. I particularly like this presentation today. Journalism and the Wall Street Journal in particular are near and dear to my heart. My brothers, Pat and Steve, are here. I'm one of 7 kids. Our sister, Denise Lavoie, is an Associated Press reporter. She's been a reporter for 33 years. She covered the shoe bomber, the Boston Marathon bombers, Whitey Bulger trials, Hernandez trial and suicide. She just covered James Field, the Charlottesville white supremacist who drove into. So she's covered legal affairs reporters, won awards. And your comment, Mallary, about asking questions all the time, that explains Denise as she does. It's crazy because she's asked questions all the time to this day, and so she must have been bored to be a journalist. Wall Street Journal in particular is near and dear to my heart because I just have vivid memories of my mother, and whose name this lecture series is. She was an accountant, sort of a bookkeeper, self-taught, never went to college, but loved financial news, loved looking at the stock market. She invested. My father didn't do it. She was the one who did it. And every morning she would get up at 5 a.m. and read that Wall Street Journal, and that was when you had to look at her stock quotes, with a ruler to be able to see it every day. And so I just have these vivid memories of my mother reading the Wall Street Journal every day, and really so instilling a love for finance and business in my 2 brothers who are accountants and masters in finance and all of that. Legal people too as well. I still love physical papers too. I'm probably the last person in America. It's a physical copy of the New York Times every day. And I love to read it. I do co-host it though, so not like I'm in the environment, so we can do that. Science writing is also really near and dear to my heart because I took one of those zigzag paths. So I think Mallary was talking about. I had got an undergraduate degree in chemistry here, and then I got a PhD in chemistry. And during my PhD, I said, I don't really want to be at the bench doing research. I do love to write. I loved writing when I was an undergrad here at PC. I loved writing those papers or review articles, synthesizing information and putting it out there. And so I looked into the field of patent law, and that's what I've done for many years now. First at a law firm, Fish & Richardson, and now at a biotech company called Treeline Biosciences, where we focus mainly on oncology, Brianna. So maybe you'll write a wonderful story about Treeline when we hopefully launch some drug products for cancer, various cancers of unmet need. As a patent attorney, we have to do a lot of what you discussed today in terms of communication, right? So we have the themes of who is your audience, thinking about their audience, right? And then how are you going to have that impact over time? And then how do you tell this story? So if you think about a patent and being a patent attorney, you have the scientists that you're writing it for, right? They've spent a lot of time in the lab. If it's a drug for cancer, right? It's really, these people really take it seriously. The speaker last year, we heard her talk about how she's one of the inventors on Moderna's mRNA vaccines, right? So she's incredibly soft-spoken, but she's clearly so passionate about that. Which she talked about when they opened up the email from the FDA about what the efficacy was on there, and how everyone just started crying in the room, right? It's just really moving, because it's that personal impact that pharmaceutical biotech industry is portrayed a lot as sort of just trying to make money, evil people, right? But the scientists that are in the lab doing that day to day, that's not what they're there. They're there because they love the science and they really see these unmet needs and really want to help people. So you have the scientists that you're writing it for, and maybe your executive team, your business development team. Then you have the patent examiner who's really cut and dry. Is this new? Is this novel? Is there a patent for it? And then you have investors that might be looking at it, and competitors who are saying, do they really have something here? Are they really good scientists? What is this going to lead to? Are they in a space that I'm in? Should I get out of that? Should I move to something different? Should I follow them? Then there's the judge and the jury, which is a whole different level of the story that you have to tell, right? You have to tell the story of why there's this unmet need, why you deserve to have this patent, how it's helping these patients, how this person, these scientists toiled in the lab and really came up with something that's really helping people. So it's really that story from so many different dimensions, and then thinking of that audience now, your scientists now, but then the judge and the jury that might be 50 or 20 years out, how to be able to tell that impactful story. And as case law is changing too, right? So if trying to look ahead at, like read the tea leaves. To the undergrads here, I think the themes that Mallary and Brianna were talking about, fact-checking, looking for truths, considering both sides, transparency, that goes to being with scientists too, not just a communicator, right? You have a theory of something, you've got to be willing to really do your fact-checking, really being transparent in your research and how you're doing it, what the results are actually saying, right? Like a lot of people, in the biotech industry too, in pharma, they get swayed with, we've spent so much money, we spent so much time, you know what I mean? Like, and just keep going, right? Versus sort of making that hard data call or making that decision. So I think those are really important. You've also seen lots of reporting lately about fraud in science, and so people wanting to get that science or that Nature Medicine or whatever paper, right? And tweaking the results a little bit. So I think those are just important lessons for whatever your major, but particularly for scientists, I think as well. And then finally, I think these two are just incredible examples of PC really can launch you in so many directions. Like, embrace your time here, embrace what you do, but like, don't be afraid to say, this, that path that maybe I started on isn't exactly what I want to do, but I've learned the skills here to sort of translate into something else and go after what you love. Because as you can see from these two, they're really passionate about what they've done. They love doing it. They love to teach. They love to talk to all of you. So I'm sure if you want to reach out to them, they would love that. And I guess that's it. So thank you all for your time. There's a reception outside afterwards if you'd like to attend. Good luck to the students on their finals for the rest of the semester. Thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with these two accomplished Providence College alums. Special thanks to Dr. Teresa Lavoie, 89, a member of PC's Board of Trustees, who endowed this lecture series in honor of her mother. Episodes of the Providence College Podcast are available in all of the usual places, as well as the college's YouTube channel and on your smart speaker. For producer Chris Judge, I'm Liz Kay. Until next time.